Hi everybody. Today I want to show you how to create a Scratchpad or a Notepad app using DSA data storage. This application is useful if you're having a conference call and you have keyboard and mouse control on someone else's machine and you want to take some of your own notes. You'll be able to take those notes in any browser that can access your DSA server and then read those same notes later on a different machine, which saves some of the trouble of, say, pasting those notes to yourself in a chat client and then copying and pasting them later, in which case you get a lot of extra stuff with them. Before I get started making it, I'll show you what the finished application that we're making is going to look like. I'll open it in my DGLux 5 viewer. So when the application opens, I get this blank page with a dialog prompting me to enter my name. I'll enter one of the names that I've configured, and I get a list of this person's notes. I can click a note and add to it. Then this note is continually saved. So if I go to some other note and edit that, and then click back, I can still access my first note. I can also change users by entering a different username. Now I have access to this person's notes, which again I can edit. I can also add a new note for a user. And I have a couple of buttons down here as well. One of them lets me delete the currently selected note, and the other lets me rename the currently selected note. And that's the basic use of this application. And what I'll do in this video is take you through the process of starting from nothing and building this application in DGLux 5 with DSA. Okay, what I've done off of screen capture to save time is I've added some data nodes to my DSA server here under this Scratchpad node. I've added 2 people and their notes. To add the main Scratchpad node, what I did was right-click the data node in the data panel and use add node, enter the name here and click invoke. You can see all of my data nodes are available to all of my projects. So this TV kiosk node from a different project is visible here also. Then to add people, I did the same thing. I right-clicked Scratchpad and added a node. And then to add notes, I right-clicked a person and selected add value. The difference between add node and add value is that add value lets you specify a data type, and I know that my notes will all be strings. And that's just some starter data. And what I've also done is to load my assets into my project, and to do that I just drag them from my file browser on my operating system right to this assets folder. And these are just some icons and logos I know I want to use in my application. As far as the icons go, you could also use an icon font instead of the individual SVG files like I've loaded here. And there are steps for integrating an icon font into your application on the DGLogic wiki under the text component section, and I'll post a link to that icon font section under this video. So now I have my data and my assets. The first thing I need to do is create the general structural layout of my page. And I know that I want my stage, which is the root node of my project, to be laid out vertically because I know that I want a header on this project, and that means vertical layout. So for my stage, for layout, I'll select vertical. And I'll insert a group for that header, give that group a width of auto. Since the stage layout is vertical and the horizontal alignment is stretch, a header with a width of auto will fill the full width of the stage. And I'll give it a background color. And a height of 50 pixels. I'm going to duplicate this header for my body group, and the body has a width of auto, so it fills the full width of the stage, but then to make it fill the height that's remaining, I'll give it a flex grow value of 1. And in horizontal layout, those principles are reversed. Name it body. Now I know that I want a line dividing the header from the body, so I'll go into the fill and stroke properties for the header, define a border on only the bottom. So I click this 4 and then this bottom shape, say 2 width, solid, and for color, I just want it to be a very light gray color. In the color choosers in Digilux 5, you can choose from a color array if you like, and you can also edit the red, green, blue, hue, saturation, and brightness using these other 2 tabs and these number values here, or you can enter a hex value. So that line is about the shade that I want, and now within this header group, I want to insert an image component. For the image properties for URL, I want to make this my Digilux 5 logo. Make that 100% so it's the full height of the group. I'll give it some left padding so it's not quite flush with the left edge. Then also in the header, I'll insert a text component. Right now it's on top of my image, so I'll change my header layout to be horizontal so that it will be next to my image. I'll enter my application title. And style the text. So my header is done. For the body group, I know that I'll want 2 panels, one for selecting notes and one for editing for the current note. So that means I need 2 more groups. This time I'll give them auto height. But first I need to set my body layout to horizontal. And I know that I want the body to be laid out horizontally because I want 2 panels that are next to each other. And because the vertical alignment is stretch in this body group, a height of auto makes this note list group expand to take the full height of the body group. I'll create a new group for the current note. And in this horizontal layout, if I give this second group a flex size value of 1, it will expand to take the remaining width of the group, like so. I know I want my notes panel to be a little bit wider than this. In number fields in Digilux 5, you can click and drag up or down to scrub the value so you don't have to actually type. Now, similarly to this line under my header, I want a line dividing these 2 panels. So on my notes group, I'll go to the border properties, select 4, edit only the right-hand border, and make it the same as that border under the header. Like so. And for this current note group, I'll give it a background color that's just barely gray. Something like that. Now, what I want to appear in this panel here is a list of notes for the current person entered in the hash. So in my data, I have these people right now. I have Celeste and Omar, and if one of their names is up in this URL bar, like if Celeste is in the URL bar, I want note A and note B to appear in this panel. So I'll go into my data flow for this stage. This is the behind the scenes logic for my application. And I'll go to the browser API and I'll add this web document block. This web document block has a property called hash that communicates with the URL. So if I enter a name here, the name appears in my data flow. So this document block communicates to and from this URL value. And what I want is to get the path to this person. So I'm going to need to do some concatenation. And the path will end with the hash value. So if a different name is entered, the path will change. And the first part of the path will be the parent of all of my person nodes, which is this Scratchpad node. So I'll drag this to the concatenate block, hold Command and Option so that only the path is added instead of the value, were there a value at that path, and then type a slash. And now here, the output of my concatenate block is the path to the Celeste node. And if I change the user up here, it changes here as well. Now, a very useful Dataflow block is list node. What this does is it takes a path like the one we just created. And one of the things it does is it creates a table that contains the children of the node at that path, which is exactly what we're looking for right now. So for Celeste, so Omar is currently selected, and it gives me Omar's node 1 and node 2 and the paths to those. And if I change my user, it gives me node A and node B. So the children table of this node we'll use a lot because it will always contain the list of notes for a given person. So I'm going to rename this Dataflow block current users note list. I'll rename this one current user node. So now I have a table that will always generate the list of notes that I want to appear visually in this panel. And the way that I want to render those is by using a group repeater. I'll just make that width auto and lay out the notes group vertically. Okay, the reason that I know that I want a repeater here is because I want the information here to change based on a table. And what a repeater does is it takes a symbol and renders that symbol once for each row in an input table, just like this. So I know that for this group, which I'll call note list, I know that I'll want it to use this table. So I can link this table, children, straight from Dataflow to the repeater properties of the note list. But it's not showing anything when I do that because it still needs a symbol to show. Now I need to create a symbol for my repeater to actually iterate. So to do that, I'll go to my symbols panel and click new. I'll create a name. I'll call it note list item. Lay out this symbol vertically and then give it some rows. So I want each row then to be laid out horizontally. And within row 1, I want an image and a text component. And I know that I want the image to be a pen because someone is going to click on a note and then be able to edit it. Under position and size, I'll click this button to keep the aspect ratio of the icon, and I'll make it smaller. Then I'll take the entire row, reduce the height, create some space between items in the row, and create some padding all around everything in the row as well. I'll style my text and start with that. Now I can take this symbol and use it for my repeater. Currently, a symbol is being rendered for each row in the source table, but only one symbol is appearing. That's because the note list group is laid out absolutely, which actually means that every symbol is appearing in the same location in the group. If I change my layout to vertical, now you can see the multiple instances. Since our current person is Celeste, and Celeste has 2 notes, there are 2 symbols in the repeater. If I were to add a third note, it would appear as well. Now I'll go back into my symbol and edit it. I'll give row 2 a height like row 1, and the whole symbol a smaller height as well. And I'll create a horizontal line in between items by giving a bottom border to the symbol itself. By setting the symbol and also the children groups to a width of auto and then clicking apply, I was able to make this bottom line extend all the way across. Most importantly, I need to add a property or a parameter to my symbol. This will be a string that determines the text that appears in this row. Now that that parameter is bound to a property inside the symbol, I can bind a table column to that parameter to affect the text string that appears in each symbol instance. The symbol parameter shows up here. And if I take the table that's driving my repeater, select that renderer node, and drag a table column to the parameter, it populates in the symbol instances like you see here. And the other thing that I want to appear in these symbol instances is the last time that a note was edited. To do that, I'll go back inside the symbol. And I'll use the symbol Dataflow. If I drag a note from my metrics panel into the Dataflow, it creates a load value block, which I'll rename to load value because it won't always be concerning the same note that I dragged here. What this block gives me is, given the path to some node, it gives me the value of that node as well as some other information, including the last updated date and time. If I use a date format block and pin the last update property so that it appears in the Dataflow window, I can drag the arrowhead to the date format block and enter a format. I'll just enter one format. There's a reference to formats that will work on the DGLogic wiki under scripting and syntax. And I'll take the output of this block and link it to the text component in row 2. I'm actually going to duplicate my whole row 1. Now, if some path is given to this data flow, it will return the output date and time string for the node at that path. So now I just need to make sure that this data flow block gets the correct path. To do that, I'll create another symbol parameter. This symbol parameter will get the note path from somewhere and feed it to this load value block like so. Now I'll quit the symbol, and to get that value, I'll open the table that drives my repeater and drag the path column from that table to the note path property. Now I just want to do a couple of visual edits to my symbol. I want to indent the second row. I want to change the image in the second row to a clock. And since the second row is secondary information, I'll make the image a bit smaller and the text less pronounced. Now I have a left panel that accurately gives me information about the notes for the given person, but it doesn't allow me to select a note. So that's the next step. I'll go back to the note list group and enable selection. Now to do that, I'll enable one of these selection behaviors right here. I'll use the first one, which allows one item to be selected, because it doesn't really make sense to select more than one note. With that enabled, when I click items in the repeater, this selected index changes, thereby giving the rest of my application information about user selection. Now I know that for good UX, I'll need to give the user some indication that they've selected an item. For that, I'll go back into the symbol, and I'll use this selected Boolean property. This property is very useful for creating conditional visual formatting based on selection. If I double click the blue dot next to the property, a pop-up will appear that will let me work with that property without having this section of the property inspector open. Here it is. Now I can work with this property, and feel free to scroll away from this section of the PI. I want to create a background fill that changes when selected is true. For this kind of conditional binding, I'll drag one property to the other just like in a normal property binding, but before releasing the mouse button, I'll hold Control. That opens a binding dialog. We want this section on the right for data mapping because we're creating a list of values to use for this property when different values are present for the input property. So I'll choose Boolean, and what I want is when this is true, I want the background to be a certain color. I know I want it to be a version of this particular color, which is one of the colors in my logo. And then I'll say when not selected, we'll use a background color of white. We'll start there and click OK. I know this color is darker than the final color that I'll want, but I'll test it here. Now to edit that color, I'll go back into the binding dialog by clicking this blue dot and selecting binding dialog. Then I can edit this color using the brightness and saturation sliders. I think that's close to the color that I want, so I'll click OK. I'm happy with that, so next I'll create a second binding that involves the border because I want a colored bar on the side to further differentiate the selected item. So in my border properties, I'll work with only the left-hand border, and I'll set it to always have a width of 4 and a stroke type of solid, and I'll use my binding dialog to change the color of this bar. So I'll double-click the blue dot next to the color, close the fill and stroke dialog, and create another data mapping. Hold Control here before releasing the mouse button, and select Boolean. Now we're affecting the color of the left-hand border. When true, I want it to be this color from my logo again. And when false, I want the border to be white. That's the appearance that I want, so I'll click Apply and OK. I think this panel needs a title, So above my note list group, I'll add a text component. Click Bring Forward to move it to the top of the group. And style the text. And for the value of this title, I want to concatenate the hash value with this string. To get that hash value, I'll double-click this blue dot to make this property accessible in a pop-up. Then I'll go to my stage data flow that includes my web document block and bind the hash value. Now I'll go back to my text components data flow, and I see my full concatenated string, which I'll bind to the text box. Finally, I'll add a bottom border under my text component, similarly to the borders that divide my notes. Now, based on note selection in this panel that I've created, I want to allow editing of the selected note. So in my current note panel, I'll start by adding another title. I want my current note panel to be laid out vertically because I'll have a title, an editing widget, and then potentially some buttons at the bottom. I'll style the text in my header. And then I'll get the string to display in this header, which should match the title of the selected note. To get that, I'll go back to my stage data flow and look at my current user's note list. The information that I need is right here in this column. It's the note names, but there are too many of them. To get just the row that matches the selected item in the repeater, I'll use a select rows data flow block, use the children table as the input, and use the note selection index as the index. This returns a table with only one row that matches the currently selected node. In Digilux 5, if you click Preview once, any pop-ups that were open disappear, but if you immediately click it a second time, they reappear. This is a shortcut to let you look at your whole application holistically, but then return to what you were doing. So if I change selection in this panel, my one row table changes. And I always want the cell in row 0 column name of this table to be the title of this panel, which is as simple as dragging the table cell to the text property. Now this title changes when I select a different note. Right, now I'm going to cheat a little bit and bring in a WYSIWYG HTML editor widget that was created by someone on my team. I'll make the widget available below this project so you can import it into your own project also. If you prefer to not edit with HTML5 markup and you just want to do simple text, you can use the text area component to do this as well. To import my widget, which I've saved to a project in my Digilux 5 installation, I'll right-click on lib and select Import Library and import this project right here, which is where I have it. And then click the tab in my widget palette for that project This project only has one widget in it, which if I go to edit mode, I can drag to my stage. Here's the widget. I'll change its position and size so that it's where I want it and takes the full width and height. And now I have an HTML editor widget, but it's not connected yet to any of my notes data. To do that, I'll go back into my stage Dataflow and add a couple of action blocks from my metrics panel. I want to be able to set the value of the node based on the content of the editor widget. And I also want to be able to load the value of a node to populate in the editor widget itself. I'm calling this set value continually because that's what I've decided I want to do rather than have the user click a save button. So I'll start with loading. I want to load the value of the selected note and display that value inside the WYSIWYG HTML editor. The load value block, when given a data path, returns the value at that path and also some other information. I know that I want this widget to always load the value of the selected note, which is actually in this single row table we created earlier. So I'll use that path for my load block. Now what I want is when I select a note, for that selection to trigger loading the value at that node. So to do that, I'll go into my Dataflow again, and I'll use a state block. The state block is useful whenever you want to invoke a change in state based on some event. And a change in state means the change of some property. In the case of this HTML widget, it's this text property, which drives what's shown inside the widget. So I want my state block to affect the property at this path. And this path property is one property in DGLux where you don't have to hold Control and Option to bring over only a path instead of a value. You can actually just drop that right there, and instead of creating a binding, it does paste the path. Now that I've specified a path, I also need to specify what I want to change about that path. And I can find my options by clicking this button. I want to change this text property. So I'll double click that to bring it up in a binding pop-up. And what I want to change it to is the value that I've loaded. Now for invoking my state block, I'll start by invoking it when the selected index changes. So in my note list, I'll take selected index and I'll bind it to the invoke trigger. When you bind something like a number to something like a trigger, the trigger will fire every time that number changes. So now I think when I click nodes, the different content should load, which is working correctly. Now the other thing I want is for a change in the editor to write back to the selected note. And to do that, I'll use this set value continually block. Again, I want it to affect the selected note, so I'll use this path from this selected note table. And I want for value to use the value of my HTML editor. I want to invoke this action when the value of the HTML editor changes. So I'll take that property and bind it to invoke. Now I think when I write in the HTML editor, it should write back to my data nodes. And that is what's happening. Now the basic functionality of my app is in place. I can write notes and load notes. The functionality that I still need to add is creating a new note, deleting and renaming notes, as well as some general UX cleanup. Next, we'll start on the Create New Note feature. To save some time off of the video, I created the layout of this button. It's just a group component called New Note Button. It contains an image and a text component. The width of the button is 85%, and I changed the widths of the note list and the title to be 100%, and changed the horizontal alignment of this panel to center instead of stretch. And the 100% lets this repeater still take the full width of the panel, while an 85% width will let this button take up less. So now that I have this button, I want to create some functionality for it. The first thing I'm going to do is just quickly set its cursor to a hand to show that it's interactive. Secondly, I'll increase that visual confirmation of interactivity by changing the color on hover. To do that, I'll create an action. This will be a set state action, which just creates a state block behind the scenes that modifies the properties of the button when invoked. I'll invoke it on mouse, enter, and leave, since this is a hover action. And to set the actual property change, I click this red dot to record. Then I'll go to the background property of the button, darken the color, and click this check mark to finish recording. Now when I hover over the button, it changes color. Now when a user creates a new note, I want them to be required to specify a name for the note. So that means that I want to bring up a small pop-up when this button is clicked. So to do that, I'll use the callout properties of the new note button group. Callout in this context is just another way of saying pop-up. I'm going to select this last category because I want to have it appear on click, and this last category lets me configure the event that's going to open the pop-up. I need to specify a symbol to show up in my callout, and I've actually made the layout of the symbol already. It's not functional yet. This is just a symbol similar to this symbol we created earlier. It's just a group with some text components, and the one difference is that one of the text components is actually a text input component for the user to enter form input. So I made that in advance. I'll drag it to my symbol property, and now that is the callout of the button. So if I trigger showing it, it shows, and if I trigger hiding it, it's hidden. I'll center it on the button. Try again. Okay, so now I need to decide what will trigger showing the callout. I want the callout to be shown when the user clicks the button. Properties like that can be found in the Advanced Properties panel. In this case, I'll use on mouse up. Now when the user clicks the button, the callout is shown. The trigger to hide the callout is a little more complicated. For that, I'll have to go into the symbol. And the symbol doesn't have any data flow or properties yet. It's just some simple components. This symbol is actually going to need 3 parameters. It needs a string to act as the node name. It needs a trigger to close the callout. And it needs a trigger to invoke the action. The text input component's value will be the new node's name. The user will confirm by clicking the OK button. So we'll use the on mouse up event on that OK button. And the close callout will be triggered by either an OK or a cancel. So for that, I'll go into Dataflow. Anytime you have something that you want to trigger, either when one thing happens or another thing happens, there's a good chance that you want to use the hub block. What the hub block does is it takes multiple inputs and it returns the last input that changed, and it also fires an event whenever any of the inputs changes, or in the case of trigger properties, is invoked. So in this case, what I'll do is I'll take the on mouse up event of the OK button, and also the on mouse up event of the cancel button, and then bind on change to close callout. Now all of those properties show up under callout under the new node button. In terms of what hides the callout, it will be that close callout trigger. So now I should have two buttons that close my pop-up, but nothing's actually happening to the data. I'll go in and configure actions on these buttons, just like the actions we configured on the main button. Okay, I stopped recording to do this because it's exactly like this action that we configured here on new note. But now these buttons are interactive. Now to configure the actual data action that creates a new note, go back to the stage Dataflow. Right-click one of the notes to see a list of available actions that can be done on that note. In this case, what we want is to add a value on one of the people. This add value action will be invoked when the user confirms that they want to create a new node. And it will have the value specified inside the text input component. For the path, it will be the path of the current user, which we concatenated at the very beginning. To test this, I'll just click the button, enter a new note name, and click OK. I'll also change users and try it again. You may have noticed there's one thing missing from the logic in this button. There's one flaw, namely the value of NodeName in my callout properties is never getting cleared. That can lead to issues such as entering a note name and clicking cancel, and then entering nothing at all, clicking OK, and having a note that you don't want appear. There are a number of ways to solve this issue probably, but what I'm going to do is when this callout is shown, so when this show trigger is fired, I'll have that invoke a state block. Invoke it, not revert it. I'll add a path to that state block, and I'll use that block to clear the value of the node name property. Now, whenever the callout is displayed, this property should clear at that time. Okay, I have skipped ahead slightly again, just to skip the step of creating these groups and setting their layout. What I have here is a footer group within my current node panel. The footer group is horizontally laid out. It contains 3 subgroups. The first is a sysinfo group, which is just going to tell the user that their changes are being saved continually, and will give them a message containing the system time, and that will just confirm that the server connection is still continuing. Then over here we have a group for a rename button. It has the same kind of hover action that we created on our new note button and within our new note callout, and then a delete note button as well. These circles are created using the image component and the rounded corners, and all of this again is within a horizontally laid out group. For the system information in this second text box, I'm just going to concatenate a string that will tell me the system time. To get that system time, I will go to my system DS link and grab it from the metrics panel. I could format it again using date format, but the raw value is fine for this. Then I'll take that final string and bind it to that text box. And lighten it up a little bit. Something like that. Now for the rename note button, I want a click to bring up a call out just like this one that will let me rename the currently selected note. So again, I'll use the callout properties. I'll reuse the same symbol as before. Center it again on the component. And I'll need to configure that show trigger and hide trigger. Definitely want to show the callout on a click of the rename note button. Actually, I'm doing all of this on the group. I think I want to do it on the image. So I'll remove that callout from the group and add it to the image instead. So for the show callout, that will just be an on mouse up for the image. The hide callout trigger will be that close callout. That's the result of our hub inside the symbol. And the rename action is right here in our available actions for a data node. We'll want to invoke it on a confirm rename trigger. That should be named something else because we're using this both for rename and for new note. And the name will be the specified node name. And the path will be the currently selected node. Okay, so my rename node action is configured, and now if I enter something in here and click OK, the note gets renamed. And this button is going to need the same custom logic for clearing the NodeName property that the new note button did. So we'll solve that in the exact same way by adding a state block, invoking it when the callout is shown, and using it to clear the value of that node name property. Now for the final actual feature, I just want to make this delete note button work. So I'll go back into my stage data flow one last time, go to one of these notes and take an available data action of delete node. I'll invoke node deletion on click of this image. It will delete the node at the selected node's path. So you probably want to specify recursive just to make sure that it works. Now you should be able to delete notes. One thing that's missing from this delete note action though is that it's not changing the selection in the note list repeater. So this selected index is still 30123, even though I've deleted that note. And that can cause problems, say, for renaming, for changing users. It's just a good idea to clear this on deletion. So I'll go into my stage data flow, add a state block, invoke it on completion of the delete node block, and use it to take the selected index of my note list and set it to -1, which is the same as nothing is selected. Now when I delete a note, the selected index changes to -1. Functionally now, my app is pretty complete. It has all of the features I want. It does all of the data actions I want it to do, but it definitely needs some cleanup. For example, I'll enter some text in Omar's note 2. Now, I'll change users to Celeste. Even though it looks like Celeste's note B is selected, Omar's note is displayed in this panel. That's because we configured the contents of the HTML editor to change on a change in selection index, but we didn't actually change the selection index. Index 1 was selected for Omar, and now index 1 is selected for Celeste. There are a number of ways to fix this problem, but I think what I'm going to do is clear selection altogether when the user changes. So to do that, I'll add a state block, invoke it on a change in hash value, use it to modify the selected index of the note list repeater, and change that selection to -1. Now when I change the person's name, everything is deselected in the panel. Now of course the visual problem of having the last existing note still persists. The way that I'm going to deal with this is by hiding this entire panel if nothing is selected. So to do that, I could use an if block or a case block. I'll use case because it allows me to account for both the case of a -1 selected index and a null selected index, both of which mean nothing is currently selected. Basically, this case block is going to return true unless no notes are selected, and I'll bind its output to this visibility property of the current note panel. Now, as long as something is selected, the editing panel appears, but if no notes are selected, there's no editing panel either. And that makes sense because you don't need an editing panel unless you're editing a note. Now I want to do something similar with the left-hand panel because if I don't enter a user, this panel doesn't look right either. This will be pretty similar logic. In this case, I can use an if block. And I'll say, if the hash is null, to return false. I'll use that to show or hide the entire left-hand panel in the same way by using the visibility property. Now, if I enter anything in the hash, this panel appears. So it's not limited to current people right now, but at least if it's empty, there's nothing there. Now, the last feature I want to add is a dialog that will pop up and prompt me to enter my name. So that way, in case I don't know to enter it in the URL bar, I have a little bit of assistance. That pop-up will look almost exactly like my node callout, so I'll start by duplicating that. Make a couple of changes. We don't need this hub block if we don't have a cancel button. And we really only need one trigger. Again, because there's no cancel button on this one. Now that I have a hash entry symbol, I can set it as the callout for the actual stage itself. I can center it on the stage and try showing it. Now I just need to decide what will trigger showing and hiding the callout. It will be hidden by this confirmation trigger that's still not properly named yet. And it will be shown if someone starts the application or changes the hash value and the hash value is empty. So if I go to this page with no deep link for my name, or if I delete the name that's there and don't put in a new one, I want this prompt to show up. Because that's two different sources, I know I probably want a hub block. And the easiest way to prompt this on loading of the page is going to be a stopwatch. A stopwatch counts up as long as it's enabled. This one I want to enable only if there's a hash value. I already have an if block for that, if hash, that I'm using to control visibility of my left-hand panel, and I can use a not block to reverse its value to control my stopwatch. Now the stopwatch will count up as long as there is not a hash. Now I can make my stopwatch stop at 1 by setting modulo to 1 and loop to false. Loop controls whether it starts over once it reaches the top, and modulo controls what the top is. So now when it resets, as long as it's enabled, it will reset to 0 and then go up to 1 again. It will also start up on page load as long as it's enabled. And to trigger the stopwatch on a hash change, I can actually just bind the hash value to the reset value. Now whenever the hash changes, the stopwatch will attempt to reset, but it will only be successful if enabled is true. Turns out I don't need this hub after all. After some testing, I realized that what I need after this stopwatch is a state block. The state block gets invoked by the callout being hidden, so by this hide trigger on the stage callout properties, and the state block changes the web document hash property to the value that's currently in the callout string. And then what this stopwatch actually does is when it loops, so on loop, it shows the callout. So 1 second after the page loads or the hash value changes, the callout is shown, assuming there's no hash. And then once the callout OK button is clicked, the callout is hidden and the hash value updates. So now my app is finished. I'll go into my viewer to show it to you. We have the pop-up that asks for my name. We have my notes displayed in the left panel. I can choose a note. I can enter HTML in the note. I could change the URL of the images in the HTML. I can add color or other formatting. I can edit my notes and then come back to them. I can rename them. I can delete them. If you try it out and spot a bug, leave it in the comments. Otherwise, enjoy using the Scratchpad if you want to use it. Enjoy making it yourself. And leave us feedback. Let us know what you think about this video and what other videos you'd like to see. Thanks so much.